You're listening to Magic from Wherever I'm At with your host, the magician, time traveler, and charmer, Dartagnan.
Welcome to another edition of the podcast. I am Dartagnan, and here we are with part 3 of my interview with Eric Evans. Let's jump right back in. Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and that's why I think I pound away so much on presentation in the podcast, is because for me, that's like strategy number 1 in your book, which is involvement, and that's like intellectual or psychological involvement. But also that's the part that's most absent from everybody's performances is more presentational ploys to split that. Yeah,
that's the beauty. That's the beauty of the strategies, because they give you all kinds of. Patter is possible, from the 36. It'll indicate it helps us overcome weaknesses in our shows. And that's really what finds.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And those are all presentational ploys. Those are all things that, I know when I was a kid, I wondered, what am I going to talk about? And you end up saying, would you take a card here? I'm going to shuffle it into the deck. As a kid, that's just, unfortunately, magicians don't move past that. They don't go past that,
I know.
Or many.
Yeah. But yeah, that's where you start usually, and then of course, you're supposed to move past that.
Yeah, and then that's part of maturity. That's part of learning who you are as a magician. Whether things go awry in your life, and how do you deal with them? I use perverse magic quite a bit in my show, and it's just things don't always go how I want, but I managed to end up pulling it out at the end. So.
Well, I think that's part of the whole thing is like, you're using all these tools of you're adding meaning to stuff. You're adding humor to stuff. You're adding there's so many of these tools available that just pile on the levels of dispersion that, just pile on these levels of deception and make the mysteries impenetrable, because you're not only because the way most of it's done, which you just talked about how people use a processed pattern and just they're basically doing the method laid bare, basically, that the only thing you're left with is the analytical, the spectators are in analytical mode trying to penetrate the secret method. And that's a horrible position. We've all been busted out even when we were applying some of these things. So it's like you're really walking on a tightrope if you're not availing yourself of these strategies.
Well, and it's the importance too. I mean, if a person sees just something laid bare and they're being walked through the process, then that really is the only thing that's important to the magician, and unfortunately won't be all that important to the layman, but that's all they have to go on. Whereas if you have a full presentation, and it doesn't have to be a story trick or anything like that, but if you have lots of times the props themselves can be imbued with meaning just by the way you treat them. The way you handle them, your expressions or whatever, and that's something that I think is lacking. And guys just don't see it. I think so many, and that's why I was so grateful to Cellini, especially because he taught me more about this than anybody else. Ernie did with the slides and stuff, but a teacher's importance to an individual is just to show that student that it can be done.
Right.
It's when I met Ernie, I didn't think that I would ever be able to perform a side steal, or much less a pass or a double lift or any of those things. That was my goal, was just to be able to do those few things at the 4.5 years or whatever that I studied with him. And by the end of it, I had a whole arsenal of material, slides and stuff. But again, I needed him to show me that the one-handed top palm by Jean Dugard could actually be performed,
Yeah, I think it's obviously, like you said, people get stuck on the very basic process pattern. They often get stuck, of course, just on what I like to, to me, it seems like there's almost like I always refer to Gollum from the Lord of the Rings. When it comes to tricks, people get so enamored with the tricks. It's like Gollum. It's like, it drives you insane to the point where all all your focus and attention is on the methodologies and the sleights and the tricks themselves, and not on the actual part that turns it into magic, really, which is everything else most of the time. So I think you're lucky, of course, to encounter such great teachers. I've been lucky to avail myself of teachers, great teachers, yourself included. And of course, there's, for people who can't directly latch onto someone individually and have instruction done either in person or talking like we are, of course, reading books and stuff is like such a big part of how I began to learn, like we talked about at the very beginning of this interview. And so, when people learn from YouTube and stuff now almost exclusively, it's like painful to me to see that.
Yeah, unfortunately. I mean, a book will bring out your imagination. A book will help you visualize things. You don't have everything, just laid out for you on a platter, and so you robotically mimic it. And that's something that I really think that this generation of magicians are lacking in is just imagination. I know there's some gifted individuals out there that kind of buck the trend, but unfortunately now more than ever before, people are just more and more concerned with the latest trick. And I think, unfortunately, I think those guys are like the guys that create this material that's just a rehash of stuff in Tarbell or whatever. Those guys are, imaginative parasites. I don't think they add anything to the art. I think, on the contrary, they clutter it with a bunch of nonsense. And because the real power, I mean, it's like Cellini, he at one time he gave me a little booklet called The Lord of the Rings, and it was on all the different ring moves that he used with just 2 rings. And in it he wrote, remember, you are the magic. The magic is in you. And he underlined you. We're the most important part. It's not a trick we buy.
Right.
It's who you are as a human being. Do you relate to people? Do you want to relate to people? Do you want to feel, them to feel empathy for your plight if something goes perverse? Do you want them to identify with you as a human being? Those are the deep lessons that the magicians are not getting these days. It's just not out there, other than, your podcast, my modest efforts on YouTube that I've taken most of it down now. Those were just place marks for my own thoughts. I just wanted to get that information out while I could. But with a few exceptions here and there, it's just not, maybe Tamariz, talking the magic way, put the emphasis on you, not so much these props in your hands. Those are the most unimportant aspects of what we do, really. And if you say that to a move monkey, they're going to get offended. It's like Ernie. Ernie, when he was doing something, he wanted somebody to look at his hands. He never wanted to have to make eye contact with a single individual. He wanted,
right.
And so when I saw Cellini, it's like, here is the example. This is the magician that I imagined when I was a kid.
Right.
And he was so much more than tying some knots in some handkerchiefs and they magically dissolve. He was something, he was the whole package. So.
Yeah, that, like I said earlier, I think unanimously that's from what I've heard of people who were there and saw things and were around that time period. They're all unanimously agreed that he elevated the art when he was in his own work, of course, and it was contagious.
Yeah, he had such a love for magic. I remember the first time I met him in '91 in Dallas. He was there for a couple of weeks. There were 2 friends. I was lucky in that the 2 street magicians that were working in Dallas at the time had both witnessed Cellini, one of them had witnessed Cellini and another had read about Cellini, Brian Bloodworth and Merlin, the magical one, and they were having a feud at the time. Merlin and Brian were not happy with one another, but they got together because Cellini was there. They all met at my place. We all hung out and had a nice session, mostly just discussion and just enjoying each other's company. And that's something that Jim at the time said. He said, I understand you guys are having a disagreement, but I think it's wonderful that you came together over a love of magic, and that's one thing that I'll never forget. Everybody kind of placed their differences aside for a time being.
No, I think that he did seem to have this quality of uniting people. One of the stories that and I don't know this to be true, and I think we've talked about this before in person, but I don't recall your answer. But I heard the story about Cellini that I don't even recall who told me this. I wish I did. But about him being hired sort of in his later years, him being hired for a gig, somebody helping him get some work. It was at this weird, I want to call it like a restaurant, but it was at some sort of event. And then they had this weird thing where you were basically in the round. And then the in the round part was like a kind of a stage, and the stage rotated. So you kind of went table to table, but basically the tables are stationary and the stage rotated. And, he had brought something like he had done the silk vanish, and he had brought his wand. And the story I heard was basically he did the silk vanish the first few tables, but when he brought the wand out, he told the story about Merlin casting the staff down and it breaking into a bunch of pieces and the students collecting the pieces. And that's why wands are short, basically. And, so he told a more elaborate involved version of that and didn't do any magic at one of the tables. He just handed out the wand after he told the story so that people could hold it in their own hands. And the booker later told whoever that was the thing people commented on the most, was that they had held a piece of Merlin's wand. And I thought, even if that is true or not true, that's a hell of a fucking story. And it really points up, though, I think, like what you're saying, which is it comes from you. It comes from within. And he gave this wand and the history behind it and stuff. He gave his own personal touches or whatnot. And then people remembered that the most, as opposed to whatever other tricks he may have done that night.
And that just shows the validity of Tim Marie's shoes, I guess, presentation. He used to do that. He used to say, in fact, I used to say it at my lectures, starting my show. The performance part, bring out the wand and talk about the stick. And I didn't have the gravitas to pull it off the way he did, so I always added a blow off at the end. Which got a little laugh,
right.
But still I retained some of the benefit of the initial statement,
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, in terms, like you said earlier, and I think this is where people get confused a bit too, when I've talked about presentation on I know this to be true because people have told me that they've emailed me or I've talked to them later and they're like, oh, that's what you mean. And I think the effect you use, the balls from the mouth that you use on the street to close your shows, or at least recently from what I've seen, is a perfect example of something that isn't a story in a literal sense that people would probably characterize as a story. But if you look at the thing from start to finish, it has this full presentation. It ends on a joke, essentially, which also points up something about your character. And there's all these nice little bits all the way through. But the very fact that you refer to it as the ball of death at the beginning then becomes more interesting when, you actually choke later. Yeah. And it's all done in a subtle way where, like, you call it the ball of death, but like, why? Like, I don't know what people think, because I've sort of always been around you and known you. So I don't know what people think, but you call it the ball of death and I don't know what they expect to have happen. And then when you do choke, it's like a surprise, which of course they never saw coming, really. So and then that's when you even say it literally, I think, in the thing, and that's the death part. Yeah, I think that's such a nice way to weave presentational things. And then at the end, you talk about your cat, which is an important, because Tamara is, I think, the third part, the ugly, the last of the 3-part series. I talk about something I didn't really agree with Tamara's either in his book when he talks about comedy. And according to Tamara's, you kind of violate that on that particular trick, according to what he tells people in his book. And like I said, I'm not in agreement with what he says, because I've had different experiences myself. And it was something that sort of stemmed from what Bill Malone had said. I think on one of the podcasts I talked about this, where Bill Malone would try to get both. He would try to get the humorous aspect, and he would try to get the magic. Right. If he could squeeze both out. And I think that's a much better approach. And it's like, for some reason, it's much deeper because it adds this punctuation. I've never had, I think it's hard to say too, because of course it can be done wrong, I'm sure, but because everything can be messed up. There's been at least one case in my current show where I put the comedy right on top of the revelation, literally together, and it only served to boost it. So it's whereas Tamara's is more saying you should stay away from combining those two. So it can be done wrong, obviously, and I think that's probably why he's saying that, because that's probably more likely.
Well, yeah, if you're turning a powerful piece of magic into a flippant little,
right.
Gazzo advised me. He said after watching my show, this is several years ago, he said, I don't think you should say that. I don't. Right. I think you let him off. He said, I think you let him off the hook when you say that. And I could see his point, mm-hmm. but it falls in line. Something pet theory of mine, I call removing the sting, mm-hmm. Kind of blunting the sharp edge of the trick, because a lot of times it's like my coins through the knee. When I do the downs, Tommy downs, coins through the knees. I used to have that in the beginning of my show during my normal coin routine, my opening coin routine. And there were several occasions, many summers, when I observed people backing up and I would lose my crowd, because it had a lot more impact on them than I thought it would. I mm-hmm. never thought anybody would be fooled for a moment for that, with that trick. But it fooled them so bad, it made them uncomfortable, mm-hmm. and it was unsettling to them. So I realized that if magic is too strong, it can be extremely unsettling. Unless you use a little bit of humor to take the sting out, mm-hmm. And kind of shut the door on it, mm-hmm. Then they will not be complying in the future. They have a reluctance. They have just shying away from. I don't know if you've ever performed for Jamaicans.
Oh yes.
They get very unsettled.
Yeah.
You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Uh-huh.
They take it very seriously. To them, it's not a game. It's a real thing.
Yeah.
Same thing with Middle Eastern people. Middle Eastern people are the same way. They think it's real.
Yeah. And of course, that's the way you're trying to make it look. So it makes sense when you see it from their perspective, because you're like, yeah, how did you do that? Those are supernatural powers. And I think that's the other point too, is like you're combining comedy around it like that. You're taking this thing off it, but you're also, again, pointing, in the one that I referenced from my show, it adds meaning to what is happening, and it reminds them of the what's going on here and the thematic elements that have been at play in that particular section of the show, which makes it funny because it's more relatable, because people then remember what's at play, but they're also enjoy it more because it's something we all have in common. So it's like there's layers to just a very simple comedic addition, but it adds 2 or 3 layers to something that wouldn't exist if I just revealed that the card had changed or whatever. That would still be strong, but it's not as strong, because I've tested many forth. And so not all these things are so, I think, and probably, Tamara is what he's trying to stay away from, is probably that there's so much hackneyed, gaggy, bad, just weird white van type humor and stuff that people put on top of this, that he's like, this could go wrong 10 ways and right one way,
Speaking of that, I remember seeing a magician who is, I won't name him, but I saw him in Vegas, about a year ago. And he was one of these trade show magicians, he was very active in the 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And I was surprised to see him. But he still used that same kind of humor, the sexist humor that you found during that time. And it just was cringeworthy. That performer had not updated any of their material and was still using lines, no, the clean one, but in a sexist way. It was hysterical.
Straight out of Archie Bunker.
But but at the same time, very sad.
Right. What is it?
Yeah,
it's
like what we get.
Yeah. Well, it's a deft touch. When you come down to everything, there's like, when I first saw, everyone who listens to this podcast will know that I have an affinity for Tommy Wonder. And when I first saw Tommy Wonder on those L&L tapes, within, a couple minutes of whatever the first effect was, which was ring and watch on the wallet, I believe, I'm like, this guy, okay, I've been watching some of these VHS tapes, but this guy's a fucking magician, because it was just like there was obviously a charisma and stuff to him, of course, which is part of the appeal. But it was the way he did. It was like the nonchalance and the way he addressed people. And it was just you wanted to like him from the moment he came out. And that's, I mean, I think strategy number 2 in your thing is likability. And in Tamara's book, he talks a lot about that too, which makes me surprised that humor isn't a bigger, or he's not, because his shows really, I don't find that humorous. They're kind of, like you said, he gets a little wild and he gets silly, I would say. But there's not like a lot of, I don't speak Spanish too, so maybe it's also different when he's performing, because I've only seen English shows too. But I don't think in general, seeing even some with subtitles, that he's that humorous. He's not like a Williamson or something like this, or Bill Malone. But that humor is one of the primary tools of making somebody like you.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know a single person that really watches Gazzo and at the end, after 5 minutes, doesn't just love the guy.
Yeah, even though he's insulting people for the most part of it too, which is great.
Yeah, the Don Rickles of his day. Yeah, but you can tell that he insults people in such a way in which he's not being mean about it. He's just making observations. And that's one of the reasons, you always, to some degree, you do have to take into account the messenger. Mm-hmm. So when he told me, don't use a joke at the end, that draws away from the magic. I had to realize, well, 90% of Gazzo's show is humor. Mm-hmm. 90% of my show is magic.
Right.
I've only got 10% humor. He's only got 10% magic. So of course he would feel like, the way he does, because that's just the kind of magician he is. Mm-hmm. So
I think you're onto something there too. Because there's obviously like a continuum where there's people who are, there's more humor, like you said, Gazzo, maybe 90% humor, and you're the reverse of that. And so I think there's like this continuum where you can like dial in, because again, and we keep pointing this up in this podcast, it's generated from your being. It comes from within. So like on your day-to-day life, are you more of a humorous person or more of a serious person, or what's going on?
The one thing that we have to accomplish in our performances is that the spectator, our audiences, have to like us and they have to respect us. And as long as we cover those two bases, everything will be all right. But they can like us so much that they also respect us, or they can respect us so much that they also like us.
Right.
But you have to have those two, you have to cover those two bases one way or the other. Because if you can't, then they're not going to be focused. They're not going to be involved. They're not going to have any affinity for us whatsoever.
Right.
So as long as we can get those things done, and learning how to do that is I guess that's the real veil, right? That's the big veil.
Yeah, I think one of the things too is like there's a lot of ways, especially when it comes to like street performing, because there's such a direct connection to like the money and the performance, that you can go down the route. And this is what I tell people who are, because one of your friends and one of my friends and one of my other teachers, Jimmy, talks a lot. He talked a lot about like how there were people who were like money people and people who were artists, right? That's sort of the two distinctions he drew between. And
right.
people I talked to after that attempted to, their interpretation of that was different than mine, where they sort of think that, the money people are only out for money and they're not trying to work on their stuff, which some of them said, no, I'm out for money, but I do work on my stuff. And they sort of took it the wrong way. And I think the distinction he was attempting to draw was between people who would go through any effort to bilk money out of people versus people who were just more concerned with building the best show possible. And the people who were the most concerned with the money would layer on all the guilt trips and stuff more readily than the people who were more artistic, I guess, in his view, because they weren't as concerned or as broad with their, because you can do there's lots of psychological ploys, of course, you can use to attempt to extract more money out of people. And people
right.
think these things are fine to do, and you should do them and you should take every advantage and stuff. But I've seen a lot of those things have effects on crowds and stuff, which you end up getting money from them, but they don't have, your relationship is then no longer the same with those people. And I've chosen to go sort of a different route with how I go about those properties. You kind of do the same thing. So I was probably influenced pretty early on by the way you went about things. But friends of ours like Warple and stuff too do it differently. And so I've always wondered about that too. The distinction maybe like people who are they understand the subtleties of all this, and then there's people who don't.
Well, and it all boils down to kind of motivations. Why do they see this as an easy way to make a buck, and hey, they'll be admired by women and little kids or whatever, or they just love the art and they want to share it with people and do it as well as they can and make a few bucks in the process. Like you said, I mean, there are plenty of people that use every ploy in the book in order to guilt people into paying the money at the end. And quite often those people, treat their audiences like crap, and their audience does pay them big money because they want to reassure that person. They want to reassure the performer, no, we do like you. We do like you, and those are manipulative performers that I don't, have the time of day for.
They don't see the relationship, how it alters. And it's then never the same because you don't get those people like coming back, for instance, or you don't, it's like that one-off thing kind of left with this bitter taste maybe in their mouth or something.
Yeah, I don't think they're liked. That's the one thing that it's more like they reassure the performer, no, we do like you, when they don't really like that performer. You've experienced, I know from your podcast, from some of the stories that you've shared with me, that people invite you into their homes. They take you out to eat,
Oh, yeah.
That's something that happens quite often, is that people, they see our show and they just fall in love with us, and now we're just a light in their life and they want to take us out for dinner. They want to, just try and, surround themselves with that feeling that they get when they're watching us perform, and that's something that can be a very beautiful, very touching thing. I'm just saying it's not seen that often. There's only one performer I've ever seen, one street magician that ever made me feel like a little kid, and that was Jelini.
Right.
All right. That was part 3 of my interview with Eric Evans. Next week will be the final installment. Hope you're enjoying this interview. It was one of my personal favorites. Had a lot of fun. And if you wish to reach Eric, you can go to, of course, patreon.com/Eric Evans. I'm Dartagnan Magic on all social media and at magicfromwherever.com. I'll be back next week with the final installment of my interview with Eric Evans. Until then.